Thanks for listening to Wait For It. Before we start the show today, I wanted to ask for a favor that shouldn't take too much of your time. If you're enjoying the show, please rate it 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and leave us a good review as well. This helps new listeners find the show and helps us to grow the audience. We appreciate you so much. So many of you have reached out and shared how the show has resonated with you, and I've really enjoyed hearing from you. With that in mind, we're planning to do a mailbag episode, which is where we respond to some of your questions and stories in an actual episode. So if you have a question or want to share some of your experiences with weight, please email us at wait@ohitsbigron.com. Again, that's WEIGHT@OHITSBIGRON.com. That email is also in the show notes. And with that, let's start the show. Wait For It is a show about the way we feel about our bodies. Consequently, each episode may include references to gaining and losing weight, eating disorders, weight loss surgery, and weight stigma. If these topics are triggering to you, please take care while listening. We have links to support resources for anyone who may need them in our show notes. Wait for it.
You know, the bigger you get, the smaller you feel in some ways. You start to feel like invisible. Like you just don't count. You don't matter. You're like not a full person participating in the world, or not participating fully the way that everybody else is.
That's the voice of my friend John. He used to be fat until he decided to have weight loss surgery. We talked about that. But while we were talking, he kept dropping these wonderfully articulated gems about what it feels like to be fat. That part where he says you're not a full person participating in the world, or not participating fully the way that everybody else is. That's kind of the ethos of Wait For It. That's where all of this started for me. I've constantly felt like I was waiting for something to change before I took real steps towards my future. A future where I could fully participate in the world. And I'm trying to get there, but I have this feeling of being trapped in a loop.
The fear that other people are judging me for my weight or my appearance makes me feel bad about my weight or my appearance. And it like at some point that recursion bleeds into itself. You know, you're trapped by this culture, whether you want to be or not. It feels like, to me anyway, I'll say I'm trapped by this culture. Like I say, emotionally, I think I can't escape it despite my intellectual best efforts.
John couldn't escape weight stigma emotionally, so he physically escaped, changed his body through surgery. I feel this. Whether it's the way I'm constantly thinking about my weight, the way I feel judged by others, the visits to the doctor, the cycle of weight loss and weight gain, or the struggle to find good clothes that fit, this is the loop I'm trapped in. This repetition, or recursion, as John calls it. And personally, I haven't found the right way for me to emotionally escape this loop. Which calls to mind what we heard in episode 4 from Tracy Cox, an opera singer and fat activist artist.
I think that there are many people who the only choice that's accessible to them is to try to escape that oppression however they can. So if they can only escape it by getting weight loss surgery, then I want them to escape it how they can. But if they can throw off the mantle and if they can join in this fight and this movement to demand equity, that's what I hope for.
I love that Tracy acknowledges that for some people, weight loss surgery is a valid form of escape. But I also love that she's put out this call to arms to throw off the mantle and band together to push back against the oppression. And what I love the most about this call is that she's acknowledging that it's not all on us. we didn't create this loop of shame and judgment and exclusion. I've always felt like the onus was completely on me and my self-esteem. And while I know I could and should feel better about my body, I still feel like too much of the blame falls on individuals rather than on systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a concept you get to in your book really quickly. I mean, you get to that in chapter 1. While I was looking for an escape, I came across the work of Deshaun Harrison. Can you introduce yourself?
I am Deshaun Harrison, a writer, media strategist, community organizer, person who exists in the world, who loves music.
Deshaun is a Black, fat, trans theorist and abolitionist. Most of their work revolves around, well, I'll just let them say it.
Destroying the world on behalf of Black, fat, trans folks.
Today, we're going to have a conversation about the destruction of the world, which I hope shows me how to escape the culture. I'm Ronald Young Jr., and this is Wait For It.
Waiting.
Wait for it.
The wait. Destroying the world.
Wait for it.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Like Progressive home and auto policies, they're best when they're bundled too. Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
I want to tell you about a new show from Radiotopia Presents that we're really excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Host Jess Shane puts out an open call on Craigslist for aspiring documentary subjects and selects 4 to work with. Together, they pull back the curtain on what really goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows, showing what it takes and what it costs to collect, edit, and consume stories about people's real lives. Radiotopia presents Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative, out now on your preferred podcast platform.
Wait for it.
I don't need to change. The world needs to change. That's kind of where I arrived. And that's a concept you get to in your book really quickly. I mean, you get to that in chapter 1. I almost closed the book. Deshaun wrote a book entitled Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness. And 7 pages into the book, in chapter 1, Deshaun begins to address body positivity directly in a way that I hadn't heard before. And it's on page 7, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Body positivity individualizes something that is bigger than the individual. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. We are in the middle of a moment, I'll call it, where everyone's trying to make our experiences individual experiences, right? They're trying to individualize an experience that's not specific to any one person. And in doing so, it sort of teaches us that, like, if you just love yourself more, the violence of anti-fatness will go away, right? And
Yes.
It's like, actually, no, that's just not how any of this works. What I'm trying to make clear is that, one, how not being confident in yourself or how not loving yourself is actually an institutional response to systematic violence, right? Like, it is impossible to love yourself 100% of the time, to feel confident in yourself 100% of the time, when you live in a world that is teaching you every single day that you deserve to die, right? There's no way to love that self, that body, that person always at all times in that kind of world. But beyond that, even if you could magically do that for yourself, right, it doesn't undo the fact that we exist in an anti-fat world, which means that fat folks largely are experiencing the ramifications of this violence. And no one individual not feeling the harms or the effects of that violence completely undoes the fact that it exists.
I think there's a way in which I've interacted with body positivity as morality. And when I say that, I mean, it feels sometimes like because I don't love myself, I am the problem. It still puts the onus on me. I'm fat now and I've been in shape. So I've been straight size and I've been fat. And at some point I found myself at the intersection of diet culture and body positivity, where I had one group of people telling me that it's my fault that I'm fat, and I had another group of people telling me that it's my fault that I don't love myself because I'm fat. And I felt myself going crazy seeing some of these messagings from both sides. For me, the earliest roads to what even felt like liberation was the idea of body neutrality. Just saying, leave me alone. I'm going to be over here doing my thing. I don't want y'all messing with me. And I see so many parallels between that and the ways in which Black folks have been wanting to be left alone for years. But it circles back to body positivity as morality. Why do you think it's structured that way?
Well, I think that everything about how we think about bodies is moralized, right? How we think about food is moralized, right? That's the difference between quote unquote healthy foods and junk foods. The moralization of our bodies is a long-standing thing that dates back to slavery, right? Thinking about Sabrina Strings and her work in Fear in the Black Body, where she makes clear that anti-fatness becomes a coherent ideology through the making of the slave, through the transatlantic slave trade. And what that really means is that at the point in which slaves were engaged as things that are unrighteous, that are unholy, that are immoral, in large part because of their Blackness, that also had to do with their fatness, right? Fatness read as Black. There's this dichotomy created around moral and immoral, evil and good. And so we start to moralize everything that has to do with bodies, or all things that we associate with bodies, food, dieting, etc. And so, yeah, I think that body positive movements, body positive spaces, body positivity itself exists as a direct result of systems that have already done the work of moralizing or immoralizing. I think that's part of the violence of it, is that it recreates or it reifies these very same ideas that there's something moral or immoral about the things that we do with our bodies or about how our bodies exist in the world.
Let's step back and define our terms. Can you briefly define body positivity, body neutrality, both of those terms?
Yeah, so body positivity is a movement, this idea that fat folks are deserving of love, care, respect, and positive reflections of their body. Very simply. Body neutrality is this idea that bodies are neither moral or immoral and therefore should not be engaged as such, but should just be engaged as they are. Part of a critique that I have around body neutrality, there's nothing neutral about bodies. This idea that bodies can ever be neutral means that we perhaps need to develop a deeper understanding of exactly how bodies become moralized in the first place.
Let's talk a little bit about fat liberation and fat acceptance. Can you define those? And do you think they're the same or are they different?
Fat acceptance is a movement fighting for fat people to be accepted, both on a structural level and a cultural level.
I already know what your criticisms are just from looking at your face. I already know what your criticisms are. And I think I have the same ones. Continue.
And I think that fat liberation would be defined as a movement fighting for fat people to be able to exist in the world without discrimination.
I've heard a lot of these terms during my dive into fat politics and theory. In some ways, I probably found myself adhering to one or more of them at different phases in my journey. For instance, I talked about being more of a body positivity person in episode 1 until I started to feel like that didn't exactly include me. I would say that Tracy Cox aligns with fat liberation or fat acceptance, which was a place I wondered if I could ever get to. For a while, I thought I could get myself into the headspace of body neutrality, but I don't know that I ever got there. And maybe that's because, as Deshaun points out, neutrality is hard to get to because bodies were never judged as neutral to begin with. So I asked Deshaun where they stood in order to get a better understanding of the possibilities for me. Where do you fall on the spectrum of theory when it comes to this? And if it's not one of these, which I assume it is not, can you define your your school of thought when it comes to fat politics?
Absolutely. It's just so funny to me because you're right. But yeah, so I am neither a fat liberationist nor am I someone who necessarily believes in fat acceptance. I refer to myself as a fat destructionist. I think some folks would call that a fat abolitionist, but I think fat destructionist sounds cooler.
It does. Like in my mind, I was like, destruction. So
exactly.
I'm there with you.
And so really what this means to me is that I think that sometimes we get so caught up in trying to think about what comes next that we don't actually sit with adequately, at least, what it is that we're trying to get through in the first place. But if liberation is a thing, it does not happen without destroying the things first, the things that keep us from being liberated. And so I'm interested in sitting with the harder conversations, the tougher aspects of this that we don't actually like to sit with because it makes us pessimistic or it makes us unhopeful or whatever. But, I want to sit with the things that make us feel pessimistic because I think that if we are to ever get to a place where we revolt, right, we have to know what exactly we're destroying. We have to know what it is that's keeping us tied to this anti-Black world, that's keeping us tied to being engaged in these anti-Black ways. And the only way to do that is to sit with what we need to destroy.
Destroy the world. That sounds scary. But when it's the world that's been oppressing you, it takes on a new context. For a long time, I thought that what needed to be destroyed was internal, that I needed to destroy my perspective on my body, my opinions on my self-image. But thinking about mine and other fat folks' perspective on the world kind of points to what actually needs to be destroyed. What's causing those perspectives? What's creating those feelings? These are still introspective questions, but they're necessary to point to an emotional truth. Most of what makes us feel bad about our bodies is external, not internal. Which means that when I hear about destroying the world, I think about everything that's reminded me that I'm not worthy suddenly being gone. That type of destruction isn't scary at all. It's exciting. Hello, Wait For It listeners. I hope you're enjoying the show. And I want to invite you to check out another Oh It's Big Ron Studio show called Leaving the Theater. Leaving the Theater is a television and film review podcast that started with me reviewing movies as I walked out of the theater immediately after seeing them. It's now expanded to include me reviewing television and streaming titles on my couch as well. These are the freshest take on what we just watched, and it's a lot of fun. On each episode, I talk with my movie-loving friends or colleagues from other podcasts, and we rate whatever we watched from 1 to 5 stars. If you're an overthinker like me, you'll enjoy agreeing and disagreeing with my analysis. Again, that's Leaving the Theater, available everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Wait for it.
Deshaun and I continued our conversation, and one thing I noted about their book, Belly of the Beast, was that I found inclusion there in an unexpected place. In episode 1 of the podcast, I talk a little bit about body positivity and kind of my journey into understanding and being more into the accepted side of my body was through body positivity, was through learning about, just all the quotes and stuff that you see there. But what I found that for me, and especially, and I kind of like walked through this discovery in episode 1, was that body positivity doesn't always feel like it was made for the Ronalds of the world. And can you talk through the ways in which it's been exclusionary or inclusionary in its methods?
Yeah, you're right. It was not made for the Ronalds of the world. And that is a big part of why I wrote Belly of the Beast. Not just body positivity, but fat scholarship in general has been very specific to cis white women. And the few interventions that we have gotten from Black folks have also been about cis people. And so for me, I was like, okay, there are a whole host of fat folks who are trans masc or who are non-binary or who are cis Black men who are not necessarily being thought about in these interventions, who are not necessarily being considered in these interventions, and a host of other trans people, right, who are not being considered in these interventions. It felt like there was this sort of commitment to thinking of fat oppression as something that was distinctly, quote unquote, female, and thinking female solely as cis woman, right? It's largely a big issue because it just innately leaves out trans folks, but also does this sort of thing that sort of suggests that there is not social implications around how we even define female and male. So for me, it was important to bring an offering that did hold more of the Ronalds in the world, or perhaps more names that we know, more of the Mike Browns and the Eric Garners, that held the Breonna Taylors, right? But that also held the sort of theoretical framings around how fat Black trans folks are engaged in the medical industry, how health itself has been constructed as a sort of violent response to slavery, right? To think through how we think about the construction of obesity as a disease, right? In relation to the construction of a war on drugs. And so we have, women, gender, and sexuality studies, we have fat studies, we have Black studies, but there are many of us who sit at the intersection of those disciplines who should also be held. And that's what I was sort of shooting for.
I am so excited to be included in this way. And I say that not because cis Black men aren't included when it comes to most discussions about anything. You know what I mean? Like when we think about patriarchy and what cis Black men do to the Black community, we know that in a lot of ways, our existence is sometimes just damaging to our own community. But to know that in a way that I feel like I've been left out of this inclusionary place called body positivity, finding this was like finding a gem to say, hey, I really want to be included here. Can you talk about the ways in which trans folks, cis Black men, Black femmes, everyone have not been included?
Yeah. When I first started reading about fat studies in general, I was like, this is all really great. It gives me a lot of language that I did not have before. Like I'm grateful for this. But I was always like, as good as this is, this really doesn't feel like it fully encapsulates who I am. Like I don't feel like I'm completely held by all of these writings. And then I was finding more writings by Black folks, like through Tumblr or through Facebook. And I was like, okay, this helps a lot. This is really good. And I'm still feeling a little bit left out. I don't really know, like, I don't really think that we have really gotten to the depths of this. And I remember thinking, like, why does no one make the connection between fatness and police murder, right? At the time, all of the people that we had seen cross our screens, the cis men in particular across our screens who have been murdered by police, were fat. And I was just like, there has to be a connection here. No one's making this connection. This doesn't make sense to me. And then in 2018, someone by the name of Kiese Layman wrote a really, really, really brilliant memoir called Heavy, an American memoir. And it changed my life forever. I was like, okay, even though I'm not a cis man, I grew up being socialized as a Black boy in the South. And the way that he wrote so intimately about that experience for me was like one of the first times I felt like my childhood was being held in fat literature. And he I don't think would call himself a fat studies scholar, but he wrote something that to me is some of the most important fat scholarship in the world. And when I got to that book, I was like, okay, yes, this is how I've been envisioning this. And now I have to write something that holds trans folks and that also holds Black mask positionalities in general, because there is a connection here. I knew I wasn't making this up, and now there's more studying to be done. And as I did more reading, I found, which I write about in the book, I found, about Chicago and the ways that they played this particular game, where they made it a contest to lock up as many people as possible based on weight. And I won't even get into all of that because that's a whole story in and of itself. But I just found so much literature that helped me connect the relationship between the war on drugs and the war on obesity. And I found just so much literature on the ways that health has been constructed around slavery, right? Thankfully, Sabrina Strings released her book in 2019. So I literally had those two books back to back that helped me formulate all these different ideas and helped me really find what I wanted to research exactly. It was like, there's no way to get to Belly of the Beast without those two books, because they really helped me realize that I wasn't making things up in my head and that we deserve to be held in more of the literature than we are.
Deshawn mentions this book by Sabrina Strings entitled Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fatphobia. In it, she discusses essentially how fatphobia and anti-fat bias can be traced back to slavery and anti-Blackness. These are concepts that Deshawn touches on in Belly of the Beast as well. The connections that Deshawn makes about fat Black folks and police shootings was also pretty spot on for me. When Eric Garner was killed after being arrested for selling loose cigarettes outside of a convenience store, I instinctively knew that any perceived resistance from this large Black man, being both big and tall, would be viewed as a threat to the cops that subdued him. His mere existence agitated their senses. Then, when he died on the sidewalk while repeating that he couldn't breathe, I remember reading commentary that he died because he was fat, and not because of the violent way that the cops decided to arrest him. I understand how being fat in an interaction with the cops can be a death sentence for Black folks. As a Black person, I've always understood marginalization, and I've understood how that marginalization was connected to fatness. But having it spelled out for me on the page was illuminating and incredibly cathartic. Being considered in Deshawn's writing gave me a place of inclusion in this space that I've been looking for a long time. But considering that connection between being fat and Black brought to mind another thought that I specifically wanted to talk with Deshawn about. So personally, I struggle with being called fat. I struggle with the fat word. And the only way I know how to explain it is the same way that I understand the N-word. I use the N-word a lot. I use it with my family, with my friends. It's a word
Same.
that is meant, it means safety. It means there's warmth there. Like it's just there. It exists, especially amongst familiar folks. And Of course, there's folks that I don't ever want to say the N-word. I don't ever want them saying it. I don't want them thinking it. I don't want them saying it in a song lyric. I'm watching y'all at weddings. I'm watching y'all at baseball games, whatever, in the club, wherever. I don't want you saying it. And I feel that way about fat. I feel that way because there's been ways in which I've described myself as fat. There's ways in which I've understood that I am fat, but there's also ways in which I've heard people say fat, even especially folks who are straight sized, use it even as a descriptor with a tinge of a smirk. With a little bit of even when I describe this podcast to people, I'm saying, like, I'm telling stories about the lives of fat folks. I've had people be like, "Heh," and I'm like, "What are you laughing at? What, the fat folks is funny to you?
Right?
Like,
what's
happening?" And so I struggle with using the word fat. Can you talk to me about why I struggle and how you use the word fat and how you've come to accept using it as a descriptor beyond, or even if you allow straight size folks to use it in that way? Like, how do you understand it? And I wanted to talk to another Black person about this, because I knew you would understand.
No, I absolutely do. I first of all, I think that your aversion to this word is valid, right? Like your aversion to the word being used, particularly by thin folks, by non-fat people, it's valid, right? Many of us grew up with that word meaning something very, very different, meaning something particularly violent, and it was fighting words, right? Like, you call somebody fat, now we got to scrap.
Yeah, what's good?
Right. So I hear that and I get the aversion to it. And I don't think of the word fat in the ways that I think of the N-word. I think of the word fat in the ways that I think of the word Black. Because Black too was used as a slur at one point in a way that's very different from the N-word, in a way that has been reclaimed and used differently than the N-word. I don't mind people saying the word Black, right? Irrespective of your race, whatever. You cannot say the N-word to me if you are not Black.
Correct.
that is still fighting words.
Yeah.
Irrespective. But you can't call me Black because I am. Even though sometimes people will still use it with that, like you said, that smirk.
Yeah,
they will still use it, and you can hear the N-word undertone when they use it, right?
Yep.
Fat feels that way to me, in terms of reclaiming a word, right? We've reclaimed fat as a way to explain our experiences, to describe ourselves, to talk about a graphic of people. Black is the same way. There's Black studies. We talk about Black people. We explain Black issues, right? It doesn't mean that people are not using this word in a way that is derogatory or in a way that is intended to harm you, but it does mean that it has various uses and has been used to and is used to describe our individual selves, to describe a demographic of people, and to describe our experiences in the world. And in that way, I think that fat is on a similar trajectory to the one that Black was once on, right? And sometimes you'll still meet white folks who just will refuse to say the word Black, right? They'll say people of color. They'll say no, for real. They'll say all the things. They will not say Black. And I think that that's true too for fat. And I think a lot of folks will just not say fat. They'll say larger. They'll say big bone. They'll say bigger. They'll say all these words. They'll refute. Listen, they'll say thick. They will not say fat, right? And I think that'll just be true across the span of time. But to me, how I approach it is I always ask an individual how they prefer to be referred to, right? I know that some fat folks do not want to be referred to as fat. And if there's a word that you would prefer, as long as it doesn't feel outright silly to me, I will use that word to refer to you. But when I'm talking about us as a demographic, when I'm talking about myself, when I'm talking about our experiences, I'm using fat because there is nothing different about the word fat to me than the word black. And I think that so much about how we are defining this language has to do with its derogatory use before, but also our internalized anti-fatness and how much we actually don't want to be fat, how much we actually don't actually value fatness, how much we don't actually consider fatness to be a social identity that has particular ramifications in the same ways that blackness does, that gender does, that sexuality does, right? Your feelings around it are absolutely valid. And to me, I think about fat in the same ways I think about black.
I think you nailed it. Matter of fact, I know you nailed it. I think that, and I think now that you use black, I realize that the struggle is still the same for me, because
Absolutely.
When I've heard some non-black folks say black, I'm like, you say African-American because you don't know how to act. You know what I mean? And I think what I've found is the journey to fat becoming more generic, more just a descriptor, is just we're in a much earlier place on that journey.
Yes.
So what does that do for you? Like, being this fat destructionist, what does this do for you? Like, how is Deshaun feeling on a regular day about your own body, about all of the world, about all of this? Like, how are you coping when you're not on a mic, you know?
Coping with this, if that's the right word to use, has become easier, I will say. Because I have the analysis, because I do know the theory, I'm able to recognize and see the things in real time and be able to name them as such as they arise. I think a lot of folks expect that, because we have this analysis, or because we think in these ways, that we're incapable of having fun, or incapable of just being.
Yeah.
And it's like, actually, I have a lot of fun. And that does not mean that every single day, I wake up happy with myself, happy with my body, happy with how I present in the world, right? We just make clear that self-love is not the thing that's going to get us liberated. And so because of that, we know that there's no way to wake up every single day loving who you are, and that's okay. But I do tend to have lots of fun in spite of, because I recognize the fact that, if we're not doing revolution today, I got to find some kind of way to survive, right? And I'm going to have fun doing it.
I want you to write another book called "If We're Not Doing the Revolution Today," and I just want it to be musings on having fun.
If we're not doing revolution today, then hey, I might listen to some music and jam out while I'm in the shower.
There are 5 stages of grief: denial, depression, bargaining, anger, and acceptance. I think grief would be an easy way to describe what it is I'm going through when it comes to processing how I feel about my weight. If this were just about me trying to figure out how to cope with being fat, then I would say in this podcast, you've heard me or others talk through every stage of grief. The thought of being undesirable made me sad. How I handled my relationship with Caitlin is a form of denial. I tried to bargain with my doctor, and that conversation made me angry. Tracy Cox touches on acceptance when it comes to her body when she said, I am allowed to be a fat person. But talking to Deshaun only confirms this other idea that continues to grow in my mind, that this isn't an individualized experience. If it were unique to me, then maybe thinking about how I don't fit in with the world and ideas about trying to escape it would make sense. Obviously, I do think about escape, but now I'm also thinking about destruction. I'm also thinking about revolution. And going on this thought journey has firmly confirmed in my heart that it is the world and not me that needs to change. But if we're not doing revolution today, I think it's time that I stopped waiting for life to come to me. Like Deshaun said, I don't think I'm going to wake up every day happy with myself or my body. But I'm grateful for every day that I do get to wake up and try again. Special thanks to John Breeding, Tracy Cox, and Deshaun Harrison. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be a part.
Wait For It is a production of Oh It's Big Ron Studios and is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Discover audio with vision at radiotopia.fm. This episode was produced and written by me, Ronald Young Jr., with editing from Sarah Deely. Sound design and mixing from the Reverend John Delore of Starlight Diner. Show and episode art by Heather Wilder. Theme music from Jey Red, with additional music from Mass Potential, the artist DT, and the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. You can follow me on Twitter, Threads, Instagram, and TikTok at Oh It's Big Ron. That's at OHITSBIGRON. You can find out more about this show and other Oh It's Big Ron Studios shows by following us on Instagram at Oh It's Big Ron Studios and on Twitter at Oh It's Big Ron Stew. That's STEW. If you have a story about weight that you'd like to share with us, shoot us an email at wait@ohitsbigron.com. That's WEIGHT@ohitsbigron.com. Wait For It will be back next week. Sarah and I will be responding to some questions and feedback from y'all and providing some updates to the stories we've told all season long. So come back next week. And as always, thanks for listening.
Wait for it.
Radiotopia.